listeners, and welcome to the 50th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th Century Women's Novel. As promised, my discussion of Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping, which has gone on for a bit, I will wrap up that discussion in the first few minutes of this lecture and then begin setting up the next novelist and a novel in this course, that is Toni Morrison, whose novel Beloved we will be taking up for study next in the series. So I ended the previous lecture by commenting on a particular awareness of impermanence, and I promised to discuss a little bit about how the impermanence of the house is a very complex and nuanced idea which does not exist simply as opposition to permanence, but rather as an awareness of the always in transition or always transitory nature of existence of the house. This is developed through an awareness of the house as a space whose boundaries were frequently permeable. There are many references to the precarious architecture and the precarious materials of the house, and there are many references throughout the novel of the world outside the house, the physical, geographical world outside the house, breaking into the space of the house. The descriptions of the particularly harsh winter right after the death of Ruth's grandmother, during which Sylvie Foster's sisters-in-law, younger sisters-in-law arrive, that is Lily and Nona. They fail in this responsibility which falls into their hand, the responsibility of caring for two young girls, the two young granddaughters of their sister-in-law. And one of their frequent fears is that the house is so weak and is made of such poor or weak wood, and how it is so much more inferior than the brick and mortar houses that they were used to in the Midwest. They keep having this vision of the many inches and sometimes feet of snow which are accumulated on the roof of the house as somehow caving the roof in and destroying the house and burying the inhabitants under feet of snow. This is one instance, but the narrator frequently describes in a very, very cool and dispassionate manner how when it would rain, many parts of the house would become unusable, how the sofas on the ground floor would be soaked with water. And the young girls describe when Sylvie first arrives as a woman in her 30s and both Ruth and Lucille are in their early teens. One of their first encounters, or you could call it their ice-breaking moment, is when the girls, I think it's Lucille who does this, who shows Sylvie how water has seeped into the sofas on the ground floor by poking a finger into the completely water-soaked cushions of the sofa, and notices how when she pokes her finger into the sofa cushion, it does not spring back to its normal shape and water leaks out of it. So water, snow, these things are always leaking into the house, and to some extent, Edmund Foster, that is, the man who was working with the railroads and who came from Spokane, Illinois, and who built the house, there are descriptions of their grandfather being very physical and somewhat of a man of the physical world and carrying a pocket knife and so on, and being good with woodworking and doing his bit towards securing these boundaries of the house. There's a description of how the staircase to the attic had a better quality because it was built at a time when their grandfather was able to afford better wood and had greater confidence in his abilities in his skills of carpentry and woodworking. So if women are burdened with housekeeping, then at least this one man is in some ways very, very neutrally, very uncritically, very unthinkingly accepts this task of house building. Another mention here about Sylvie Foster's housekeeping. One could say that as a grandmother, Sylvie Foster has less of this kind of first wave feminist understanding and awareness of the rights or the freedoms that women have been denied and which women were eager to embrace in the second half of the 20th century. However, in the descriptions that Ruth gives us of Sylvie Foster's housekeeping, there's a magical, there's a lyrical, there's a kind of quiet resistance to this responsibility of housekeeping. There are some very powerful descriptions of how Sylvie Foster, after her husband's death, while she continues with the motions of, let's say, turning the sheets, frying chicken, stewing apples, for making pies and so on. She goes through with all of these motions that are expected of women. But there are descriptions, very lyrical, of how there was an awareness that Sylvie Foster was not really in it. There is an alienated quality to the way in which Sylvie Foster performs this labor of housekeeping, which again anticipates and cues readers in, plugs readers in, educates us, or at least hints to us that we must be aware of something. And it is this alienated performance of the labor of housekeeping which gives us a very important clue. I'll cite from Sylvie Foster and especially Ruth's description of what Sylvie Foster did and felt a little bit later. But for now, I want to talk a little bit about how Ruth describes the permeability of the boundaries of this house. This is a description of Sylvie's imperfect housekeeping. Sylvie in a house was more or less like a mermaid in a ship's cabin. She preferred it sunk in the very element it was meant to exclude. We had crickets in the pantry, squirrels in the eaves, sparrows in the attic. Lucille and I stepped through the door from sheer night to sheer night. So this is a passage, and it's on page 99. This is a passage which is very tempting to read as evidence of Sylvie's failed housekeeping, and therefore, by implication, of the novel's description of female subjectivity as heroically posited in opposition to a male or patriarchal insistence to keep the house. This is actually a somewhat unfair and not very accurate description of what the novel does. In fact, what the novel does not reduce the need to manage the materiality of the house to a male or female preserve. Rather, it invites us to imagine a vision of female subjectivity, which in turn originates from a universal impermanence of things themselves. Now, I'll read now from the very last passage of the novel, the passage that concludes the novel. This is on page 218 from in my edition. This is a description from Ruth's perspective of what the two of them, that is Sylvie and Ruth, are thinking now that they have abandoned this house, now that they have left a Fingerbone and they have ended up far away. They are living an itinerant, transient lifestyle, which is the kind of lifestyle that Sylvie had been living. A quick word about Sylvie's background and why Sylvie has always been this figure of disrepute in the novel. Sylvie has married, but has not told anyone about who this person that she married is or was. She has simply disappeared. She has lived a transient, itinerant life. That is, she travels from town to town, and very few people know her current address. It is because people know of her transient, unattached, and generally a life that is not contained or not governed by the conventional feminine responsibilities, that is, the responsibilities of raising children, maintaining a house, taking care of the house, and so on. This part about Sylvie is well known. So when Lily and Nonna, the Ruth's grandmother's sisters-in-law, find it very difficult to take care of these two young girls, they think of summoning Sylvie because they think because Sylvie is not traditionally attached to the responsibilities of families, because she doesn't have a family of her own, she would be naturally inclined and capable of taking care of Ruth and Lucille. So this is how Sylvie is summoned. And Sylvie is genuinely very happy when she's summoned and she sees these two young girls, daughters of her own sister Helen, who had driven off the cliff. But the kind of relationship, the kind of affection that these three women, that is Sylvie, Ruth and Lucille, develop is not that of a traditional caretaker with the innocent or the helpless cared for. Rather, it becomes a relationship of mutual support, camaraderie, and empowerment. Also, it must be noted, as soon as Sylvie arrives, Lily and Nonna leave. So these are the two women who flee. Sylvie Foster is the woman who dies, and Ruth and Sylvie, they do something which looks like fleeing, but actually it is a very complex engagement with the labor of keeping house. It's a complex engagement that combines the impulse to preserve something along with the impulse to let go, let decay, let die, something which feels like an unnecessary burden. And it is this last passage in which Ruth describes the difference between hers and Sylvie's itinerant lifestyle from Lucille's. Lucille, as I mentioned earlier, has fallen into the opposite extreme by moving in with the home economics teacher. It is this last passage which reminds readers to not view the ending of the novel as a one-dimensional repudiation of the labor of housekeeping, and instead to see in what appears to be simply a repudiation of housekeeping a complex mix of different attitudes to housekeeping. So this is the passage. And Ruth describes the kind of life they lived. They board a westbound train and they find themselves drowsing among the poultry crates all the way to Seattle. Right? So they board a freight train, right? And they are drowsing among the poultry crates. And at some point, they find themselves in Boston. But this is how Ruth describes the state of being in frequent motion. We had no particular reason to go to one town rather than another, and no particular reason to stay anywhere or to leave. And so this contrasts very powerfully with the image of permanence, stability, and security that is created in housekeeping, and the impression of which was first established by the magazine Good Housekeeping. I'll say a little bit about Good Housekeeping and then contrast what happens in the end of Housekeeping and describes how what may appear to be a sharp binary opposition actually conceals many points of affinity and similarity. So, Good Housekeeping is still produced by the same company, that is the Hearst Corporation. Its circulation topped 1 million in the mid-1920s, and it began in the year 1885. So, a few decades after Dickinson and Marx write about the dialectical modes of perception of the commodity world. Now, Good Housekeeping is a magazine that for over 130 years has been devoted to women and their conventional role in the home as wives and mothers who cook, clean, and rear children. This is one part of what Good Housekeeping as a magazine has helped consolidate. But this is not the full story, and in fact, this is not even the full ideological position that the magazine has consolidated. It has also been a forum for feminist authorship. In addition to publishing work by female writers like Virginia Woolf and Edna St. Vincent Millay, this magazine, that is Good Housekeeping, also published a work that would later go on to have important implications for the first and second wave feminist movements. So Good Housekeeping was the magazine which published Betty Friedan's 1960 article, Women Are People Too, which in some ways can be seen as a precursor to her book that is more well known, that is the Feminine Mystique. So notwithstanding these very carefully placed intellectual positions, the magazine Good Housekeeping with its perception, with its images, with its reputation, establishes femininity and aligns it with the maintenance of a permanent, secure, material space, that of the private home. Now, in contrast to that, the ending of this novel, Housekeeping, presents a much more complex picture. This is how Ruth contrasts her life with that of Lucille. Lucille, in some ways, appears to live the life that this magazine, Good Housekeeping, has celebrated as the ideal and the successful goal of women's lives and women's labor. Ruth, on the other hand, appears to have rejected that ideal and embraced the binary opposite of that ideal, that is, traveling from town to town, sleeping in the cargo holds of freight trains, among the poultry crates, and so on, and not having any strong reason to stay for too long in any one place. This is the apparent contrast. The novel ends by complicating this apparent contrast and encouraging us to think along a more complicated, more nuanced line. So this is how the novel ends in Ruth's words. We are nowhere in Boston. However, Lucille may look, she will never find us there or any trace or sign. We pause nowhere in Boston, even to admire a store window, and the perimeters of our wandering are nowhere. No one watching this woman smear her initials in the steam on her water glass with her first finger, or slip cellophane packets of oyster crackers into her handbag for the seagulls, could know how her thoughts are thronged by our absence, or know how she does not watch, does not listen, does not wait, does not hope, and always for me and Sylvie. So it's a remarkably powerful passage, remarkably complex passage, which does not yield easy interpretations and requires at least a couple of readings to really let its powerful meanings detonate on the surface of our minds. So what is Ruth really saying here? Ruth is saying, on one hand, she's saying a few obvious things, saying that I am in Boston with Sylvie. Boston is a big city. Boston is supposed to be this fun, happy place where women who have found some independence, who are taking a break from the drudgery of domestic work in a smaller town, can come and experience the city. What sort of experiences does the city of Boston offer to women who are on a break from domestic duties? Shopping, smearing initials in the steam on her water glass with her first finger, oyster crackers, both to eat as well as to offer to seagulls when going to the beach for an outing. These are experiences that both Lucille and Ruth can have. And Ruth's first point is that because they haven't kept in touch and they think, or everybody thinks, they are living different kinds of lives, these two women, even though they may do the same things, will not encounter each other. This is the first part. But the second part is that there is a great deal that's common. Both these women are haunted by the lives that the other woman is living. They're both twins in this way, and they cannot really be separate from the decisions that the other has taken. And this comes to us in this phrase, no one watching this woman. So someone who is observing this woman, and this woman, the phrase applies to both Ruth and Lucille. By implication both, but literally at the level of the sentence, it applies to Lucille. Ruth is imagining what people will perceive when they see Lucille, and they will never realize something that only Ruth has the awareness to explain to us, which people will see but never realize. And what is that realization which we gain from Ruth's narration of this novel? They will see the actions that she's taking cellophane packets of oyster crackers. She's smearing her initials on the steam of a water glass, on the condensation that has formed on the glass. But they will not see, and they could not know how her thoughts are thronged by our absence, or know how she does not watch, does not listen, does not wait, does not hope, and always for me and Sylvie. So throughout all these actions of watching, listening, waiting, and hoping, throughout everything that Lucille does in her life, of apparent stability, apparent permanence, right? Everything that Lucille is doing is actually haunted by her memories of Sylvie and Ruth, and Lucille is haunted by the choices that Ruth and Sylvie have made. So both parties, both sisters, are haunted by the choices that the other has made. I'll stop here and very quickly transition, and I've actually found the perfect idea for transitioning to the next novel, and this is the idea of haunting. Before I do that, I will quickly read one last quote from Housekeeping. This is on page 25 of my edition. And it's a very, in some ways, unremarkable moment, but in some ways also extremely remarkable. This is a moment in which Ruth's grandmother describes her mother being haunted by ghosts, by visions of the ghosts of babies that she would see on the street. So I'll read this passage. Once, she told us, she dreamed that she had seen a baby fall from an airplane and had tried to catch it in her apron. And once that she had tried to fish a baby out of a well with a tea strainer. Lucille and me she tended with scrupulous care and little confidence, as if her offerings of dimes and chocolate chip cookies might keep us, our spirits, here in her kitchen, though she knew they might not. Her mother, she told us, knew a woman who, when she looked out of her window at night, often saw the ghosts of children crying by the road. These children, who were sky black and stark naked, and who danced with the cold and wiped their tears with the backs of their hands and the heels of their hands, furious with hunger, consumed much of the woman's substance and most of her thoughts. She put out soup which the dogs ate, and the blankets which in the morning were dewy and undisturbed. The children sucked their fingers and hugged their sides as before, but she thought she might have pleased them in some way because they grew more numerous and came more often. When her sister mentioned that people thought it strange to put supper out every night for the dogs to eat, she replied quite sensibly that anyone who saw those poor children would do exactly the same. Sometimes it seemed to me my grandmother saw our black souls dancing in the moonless cold and offered us deep dish apple pie as a gesture of well-meaning and despair. So a quick summary and then a few comments. So what's happening here? Ruth is trying to figure out something about the way their grandmother immersed herself into the labor of caring for these two girls. And there's something haunting about the way their grandmother performed this task. There is a combination of well-meaning care as well as despair in the way that their grandmother offered them milk and cookies. It's as if in the very act of offering milk and cookies to these two young granddaughters, Ruth's grandmother was enacting a deep-seated suspicion and a fear. What was that fear? The fear was that no matter how much labor one does, no matter how much one cares for helpless children, human beings who cannot survive without the care of other people, no matter how much care one provides, there will always be some amount of suffering, some amount of discomfort and pain that these innocent human beings will always feel. So care, by definition, is incomplete. This is a fear, and it's almost a suspicion. And this fear, which takes on a kind of psychosis and a paranoia, appears in these visions that their grandmother's mother has of seeing babies abandoned in the cold street outside their window, and of leaving food, leaving supper and blankets outside for these cold and starving, abandoned babies, and learning that in fact the food and the blankets were used by dogs outside, and being told by other people that what she was perceiving was not real, and refusing to understand or refusing to accept that she was mistaken, and in fact telling to other people her conviction, sharing with other people her conviction that if anybody else had the same vision, if anybody else was haunted by this vision of cold, starving, hungry babies crying on the street outside, then this is how they would react. Ruth's point is that there is something haunting and something alienated about the manner in which their grandmother cared for them. And Ruth's diagnosis, very, very muted, very, very subtle, is that a lot of women were raised to think that there was always something incomplete in the kind of care that they performed and the kind of labor that they were required to perform to care for children. And this manifests into this kind of haunted state that very, very slowly evolves across 4 generations, from Ruth's great-grandmother to her grandmother to her mother Helen, and finally to in the decision that Ruth takes. The nature of haunting and the objects by which they are haunted evolves from abandoned babies, from ghosts of abandoned babies, to the ghosts of impermanent houses, right? All of these things, whether it's baby or a house, they require endless sacrifices, endless and unending, and the endless nature of this care produces a kind of despair, because at some point the care or the labor detaches itself from a tangible object, from a tangible target of care, and begins to snowball in a self-replicating paranoia, which very movingly Marilynne Robinson describes as a state of being haunted. Now, the idea of being haunted, and especially women haunted by images, ghosts of babies or children or other human beings in a state of complete helplessness, human beings that these women are expected to care for and would care for, because if they did not provide that care, these human beings who are at such a nascent state of development that they would simply die. Women haunted by ghosts of abandoned, innocent, helpless human beings, babies. This is the thread that connects Housekeeping to the next novel that we will choose to focus on, which is Beloved by Toni Morrison. Beloved is about the ghost of a dead baby daughter that returns in the form of an adult woman. This woman is named Beloved, and this reminds the protagonist of the novel, Sethe, that she had killed her own daughter as a way of protecting her, as a way of caring for her, as a way of preventing this daughter from entering a life of slavery. Slavery, chattel slavery, as many learners will know, was a practice, was an institution with laws and infrastructure and armies and lawyers and intellectuals backing it up. Essentially, the key idea that these armies and lawyers were supporting was the idea that black bodies were the property of white slave owners. And this entailed many forms of violence and suffering, one of which was the sexual exploitation of black women's bodies in order to reproduce this commodity of the laboring black body. It was this self-perpetuating cycle of violence and suffering that Sethe decides to keep her daughter out of at a key moment in the late 19th century. This is a moment when Seti is escaping her slave owners and unfortunately is caught by a group of US Marshals and slave catchers. Once they are caught, Seti realizes that if they are caught, they will be returned to their slave owners. And once back at the farm, Seti, of course, will suffer a lot of physical violence, but more tragically than that, her daughter would be returned to this life and would be forced to go through the same cycle of violence that she had gone through. And in that moment, Seti decides to sever her daughter's head and kill her. This is seen as a crime, and the implications of this violent act are that Seti is tried within the 19th century legal framework. While the legal consequences of killing her daughter are not that important, what plays and what remains in Seti's consciousness and Seti's memory is the kind of ethical choice she made by assuming that it would be for her own daughter. And she is haunted, Seti is haunted, and the novel is haunted by Beloved, who returns. Beloved is that daughter who takes on the form of an adult woman, who returns and forces everyone, including Seti and other characters who I will introduce briefly in the next lecture, forces everyone to reckon with the place that individuals have in these very impersonal and inevitable historical forces, and how best individuals can make meaning in historical narratives which seem to exclude individual choice. This is a question that a lot of postmodern novelists asked. What does history mean to an individual? This is a question that Marilynne Robinson also answers, but I think this is a question that Toni Morrison answers most powerfully among other contemporary writers in the 20th century. I'll continue this discussion in the next lecture. Thank you.